Can freedom become a burden, too heavy for man to bear, something he tries to escape from? Why then is it that freedom is for many a cherished goal and for others a threat? Western history, the past few centuries, was all about achieving individual freedom. Countless individuals lost their lives for this shared goal. But in the 1930s, a disturbing trend took over. Italy fell under fascist control, and Germany was ruled by Hitler in his Nazi regime. The most troubling part of this trend is how it all happened. It's not that Mussolini and Hitler took control of the nations by brute force and power. They ascended into power through legal means, and it's as if the citizens willfully gave themselves up to fascism and Nazism. It's as if they gave up their freedom on purpose. How did this happen when the West had fought for centuries to achieve greater freedom for the individual? Could the same happen in the future? Is something similar taking place today in front of our eyes? The German psychologist Erich Fromm took a deep look at this phenomenon in his work Escape from Freedom. In this video, we will dive into this work and look at a brief overview of the history of Western civilization, the two sides of individual freedom, and all the different ways in which people try to escape freedom. History of Western civilization. Let's travel back in time to medieval Europe. Most European societies around this time were built on the feudal class system, where everyone belonged to a specific social class and particular roles within society. So an individual was stuck with whatever role they were given for the entirety of their lives, and the class system had no room for individual freedom like we do today. In the developed countries today, we more or less get to choose our jobs, what we eat, what we wear, where we live, and so on. That was not the case for the citizens in medieval Europe. This all started to change during the Renaissance, with the emergence of a new economic system: capitalism. In Italy during the Renaissance, a select group of merchants did very well for themselves through successful trading, giving them more economic power. This gradually led to the fall of the medieval social structure. So before the Renaissance, Erich Fromm writes, man was conscious of himself only as a member of a race, people, party, family, or corporation, only through some general category. But capitalism during the Italian Renaissance changed all of that, and people began to see themselves more as individuals than they did before. The result of this progressive destruction of the medieval social structure was the emergence of the individual in the modern sense. While the shift from the feudal system to capitalism in the Renaissance had its benefits in terms of individual freedom, Erich Fromm points out that there was a dark side to it as well. Their economic activity and their wealth gave them a feeling of freedom and a sense of individuality. But at the same time, these same people had lost something: the security and feeling of belonging which the medieval social structure had offered. They were more free, but they were also more alone. Two sides of freedom. When we talk about freedom today, we almost exclusively talk about the positive aspects of freedom. The freedom of having choices on what to do, where to live, what to eat, what to wear, how to live. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, being able to speak our minds. These are the things that we usually associate with freedom. Erich Fromm explores the negative aspects of freedom to really help us understand why people might be turning away from it. While freedom allows us the privileges already mentioned, it also comes with an immense amount of responsibility. For the most part, no one is going to tell us how to live and what we can or cannot do. We must make our own life decisions and own up to it regardless of the outcome. While we have the freedom to choose which community to belong to, we may feel very lonely until we find the right community for ourselves. It seems that the new freedom brought two things to them: an increased feeling of strength, and at the same time, an increased isolation, doubt, skepticism, and resulting from all these, anxiety. This is the central theme of Escape from Freedom, that while freedom appears to be an obvious desire for everyone, it is actually a double-edged sword. Erich Fromm differentiates between freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from is a negative type of freedom where individuals are freed from some sort of restriction, authority, or bondage. Freedom to is a positive form of freedom where individuals can flourish independently. While the destruction of the feudal society achieved the negative freedom, positive freedom wasn't fostered nearly as much, even to this day according to Fromm. Erich Fromm states, "The lag between freedom from and freedom to has grown too. The result of this disproportion between freedom from any tie and the lack of possibilities for the positive realization of freedom and individuality has led, in Europe, to a panicky flight from freedom into new ties, or at least into complete indifference." This still seems to be an issue today. Even if we have more individual freedom than our ancestors can possibly imagine, if we do not know what to do with it, there is not much good. It's almost like money. Even if we have all the money we could wish for, if we do not know how to spend it well, we won't find happiness or meaning in our lives. It's the same with freedom. If we were born in medieval Europe, we wouldn't have had the freedom to choose our occupations at all. Today, we more or less have some freedom as to what field we want to work in. But even with this freedom to choose our jobs, if we don't know what we want, we may keep doubting our choices and lead a miserable life. Today, a lot of us have more leisure time available to us than our ancestors. But the fact that so many of us do not know how to properly spend our leisure time presents a big problem. Do most of us spend our free time in a meaningful way, or do we end up wasting a lot of it? Do we spend our free time actively discovering who we are as individuals, or do we end up spending a lot of time engaging in mindless activities just to escape problems and boredom? We are all most likely guilty of falling in the second category at some point in our lives. When we don't know how to spend our free time, which in turn leads to us not knowing how to live our lives, we naturally start to look for an escape or a place to belong to. Individuals back in the Renaissance didn't have the same amount of leisure time as we do now, but this is exactly what happened to them as well. A small portion of the population found a way to thrive in the newfound freedom, but a lot of them did not and were just left to feel insecure and anxious. They needed to find a way to escape the burden of freedom. According to Erich Fromm, this need for escape led to the rise of the Protestant Reformation during the Renaissance, led by two figures, Martin Luther and John Calvin. While their philosophies differ slightly, the basic idea behind both of their teachings are the same. Complete submission to God. Let's take a quick look at each one through Erich Fromm's words. Luther's theology. By not only accepting his own insignificance, but by humiliating himself to the utmost, by giving up every vestige of individual will, by renouncing and denouncing his individual strength, the individual could hope to be acceptable to God. Luther's relations to God was one of complete submission. Calvin's theology. The psychological significance of the doctrine of predestination is a twofold one. It expresses and enhances the feeling of individual powerlessness and insignificance. No doctrine could express more strongly than this the worthlessness of human will and effort. The decision over man's fate is taken completely out of his own hands, and there is nothing man can do to change this decision. He is a powerless tool in God's hands. The other meaning of this doctrine, like that of Luther's, consists in its function to silence the irrational doubt, which was the same in Calvin, in his followers, as in Luther. Luther and Calvin both offered comfort to the masses by encouraging them to submit themselves to God, to become part of something bigger than themselves, to hand themselves to God so that they don't have to be responsible for their newly given freedom. In exchange for submission, they were promised emotional security. No more feelings of doubt and anxiety as long as you live your life for God. Just like this, the rise of Protestant Reformation laid down the groundwork for a mindset that is susceptible to psychological submission to authority, as well as the working spirit of the capitalist era. Submission to God was essentially a temporary fix to combat the burden of freedom that eventually became a permanent lifestyle for many individuals in the West. Now, let us take a look at mechanisms of escape. Mechanisms of escape. Erich Fromm lists 3 different methods people use to give up their freedom, which he calls mechanisms of escape. The 3 mechanisms of escape are authoritarianism, destructiveness, and automaton conformity. Let's take a look at each one in detail. Authoritarianism. Authoritarianism has 2 parts to it: sadism and masochism. To put it another way, sadistic individuals who thrive on control and domination over others, and masochistic individuals who enjoy complete submission of themselves to others, both fall under the same category of an authoritarian character. Erich Fromm argues that sadism and masochism are 2 sides of the same coin, due to the fact that they are both very dependent on another individual, either in the form of domination or submission. Both the masochistic and sadistic strivings tend to help the individual to escape his unbearable feeling of aloneness and powerlessness. Psychologically, however, both tendencies are the outcome of one basic need, springing from the inability to bear the isolation and weakness of one's own self. The sadist feels complete because they have someone to rule over. The masochist feels comfort in completely giving themselves up to someone's control. And at the end of the day, they are both part of a symbiotic relationship that helps them escape the feeling of loneliness and isolation. The sadist needs the person over whom he rules. He needs him very badly, since his own feeling of strength is rooted in the fact that he is the master over someone. The different forms which the masochistic strivings assume have one aim: to get rid of the individual self, to lose oneself. In other words, to get rid of the burden of freedom. Now let's take a look at the second mechanism of escape. Destructiveness. Destructiveness is different since it aims not at active or passive symbiosis, but at elimination of its object. But it too is rooted in the unbearableness of individual powerlessness and isolation. Destructiveness may appear to be very similar to sadistic strivings, but Erich Fromm notes here that there is one key difference. The sadistic individual needs someone to control. Therefore, they do not want to get rid of others. The destructive individual, however, wants to get rid of others. Sadism aims at incorporation of the object, destructiveness at its removal. Sadism tends to strengthen the atomized individual by the domination over others. Destructiveness by the absence of any threat from the outside. Perhaps the most clear example of someone who falls in this category is that of a mass shooter. Their aim is to not rule over others, but to remove them completely. Erich Fromm claims that proclivity towards destructiveness emerges when one fails to live and realize their life in a meaningful manner. In other words, the drive for life and the drive for destruction are not mutually independent factors, but are in a reversed interdependence. The more the drive toward life is thwarted, the stronger is the drive toward destruction. The more life is realized, the less is the strength of destructiveness. Destructiveness is the outcome of unlived life. Now the third mechanism of escape. Automaton conformity. According to Erich Fromm, this is the most common one found in modern society. At the basic level, automaton conformity is where individuals conform to the social norm and adopt the kind of personality and lifestyle that their culture deems acceptable and desirable. By doing so, they can easily belong to a tribe or a group, curing any form of loneliness. Erich Fromm states, "The person who gives up his individual self and becomes an automaton, identical with millions of other automatons around him, need not feel alone and anxious anymore. But the price he pays, however, is high. It is the loss of his self." This is rather troubling because it goes against the whole concept behind individual freedom, that we can think, feel, and act as we please within reasonable moral boundaries. Erich Fromm further explains that most people believe that they are individuals who have authentic individual thoughts of their own, but in reality, that is very rare. To get his point across, he mentions how a hypnotist can plant a thought into an individual's mind without them being aware of it, and even convince them that it's their original idea that they came up on their own. Regarding the hypnosis experiment, Erich Fromm states, "It proves that we can have thoughts, feelings, wishes, and even sensual sensations which we subjectively feel to be ours, and yet that although we experience these thoughts and feelings, they have been put into us from the outside, are basically alien, and are not what we think, feel, and so on." This happens on a daily basis in our society. One other example mentioned by the author that is very much relevant today is advertising. A successful advertisement will usually tap into our insecurities, present us with a problem that we didn't even know we had, and finally, offer us a product or an experience that will solve the problem. Before we know it, the advertisement will have convinced us that we came up with the solution ourselves and end up giving into the product or service. A lot of present-day advertisements work very effectively on the majority of the population because the suppression of critical thinking usually starts early, according to Fromm. In schools, we are taught to behave a certain way and conform to the masses at a very early age. We more or less become conditioned to not have our own genuine thoughts, but instead adopt acceptable thoughts of others and believe that they are our own. Fromm distinguishes between the two as genuine thinking and pseudo-thinking, and he believes that almost all of us have been conditioned to rely on pseudo-thinking. Although there are true individuals among us, this belief is an illusion in most cases, and a dangerous one for that matter. With feeling as with thinking, one must distinguish between a genuine feeling, which originates in ourselves, and a pseudo-feeling, which is really not our own, although we believe it to be. In this digital age of the internet and social media, the idea of automaton conformity being a coping mechanism for loneliness is very much relevant. What's also relevant is that pseudo-thinking is much more mainstream than genuine thinking, and the fact that a lot of us believe that our thoughts are almost always completely original opinions, when in reality, they very well could have been planted in our minds without us knowing. The internet and social media have only exacerbated this issue. It's easier than ever to not think for ourselves and to conform to the masses. So now that we went over the three mechanisms of escape, let's go back to the original question. Can freedom become a burden? Too heavy for man to bear? Something he tries to escape from? Based on Erich Fromm's explanation, it seems so. But we are still left with many questions. Is freedom still a burden for many of us today? Can an individual be free, yet not alone? Will people continue to escape from freedom? In part 2, we will attack these questions by examining the last 2 chapters of Escape from Freedom. Thank you for watching.